Reality Boxes and Other Black Holes in Human Consciousness by Ingo Swann, the famous remote viewer at the CIA. Introduction. A beginning stimulus for this volume developed shortly after 1969, when the American intelligence agencies became aware that the Soviet Union, its KGB, and its military were officially conducting major secret research into the paranormal. This came as something of a shock to the American intelligence agencies that had long considered the paranormal as little more than a giggle factor. However, when the actual scope of the Soviet research was confirmed as extensive, alarm bells began going off throughout high government levels, and the giggle factor quickly began to undergo reassessment. An important mandate of the intelligence services is to study the threat potential of any development anywhere. So the Soviet research was soon perceived as such a threat, since it might ultimately include advanced and efficient forms of mind reading or invasive forms of psychic mind control and influencing over distances. One of the first situations that needed to be addressed was how to convert what was just yesterday an ignored giggle factor into a serious, in depth study of something that tomorrow might have serious ramifications. The initial responses with respect to this changeover were somewhat hysterical and comical, accompanied, however, by surges of serious interest in erecting psychic shields so that minds could not be penetrated. Soon, however, it was realized that the conventional intelligence services were out of their depth. So, by the middle of 1972, it was decided to form a government sponsored research project to help assess the threat and to house it at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, in California. At that time, SRI was, after the Rand Corporation, the second largest think tank in the United States, and also one of the major research arms of the Pentagon and other governmental agencies. This development meant that the governments of the two leading superpowers of the world were involving themselves in, of all things, psychic research. News of this development leaked into the ever excitable media, always lusting for fabulous stories, and so the public was extensively informed that a psychic war was already underway and that a psychic gap unfavorable to all Americans had been discovered. By a series of chance events, it transpired in 1972 that this author was invited to be a part of the new project at SRI that endured for the following rather exciting but often bumpy 16 years. At the beginning of the project, it became apparent that the personnel of the government sponsors knew very little about the paranormal. As a result, the SRI project was to provide the government sponsors with a series of bigger picture, informative background papers about it. One of these papers dealt with the historical sociological treatment of the paranormal. Psi, ESP, and so forth, with special emphasis of such treatment during the 19th and 20th centuries. This particular paper, never undertaken anywhere before, required the efforts of 8 research individuals and some 18 months to prepare. When completed, it elegantly showed, with numerous graphs and charts, that psychic gaps do exist, essentially because of societal taboo-like resistance to any development of psychic faculties and other aspects of the paranormal. It also showed that paranormal phenomena were conceptualized during the late 1800s and early 1900s, not as inherent aspects of consciousness itself, but as unusual, separate, and specific products of the mind. This led to intellectual attempts to isolate and methodologically categorize each of the products and then to study their workings via theories as to how each might independently function. It seemed a logical approach at first, but by the late 1960s, it had become increasingly difficult to distinguish between the mental workings of, say, telepathy, clairvoyance, out of body experience, etc. This meant that the mental workings of the mind did not take place in accordance with the intellectual categories earlier envisioned. However, an unexpected benefit of the paper revealed that paranormal elements continuously emerged time and again throughout history on a scope much larger than was generally understood, but only to be re-submerged by somewhat disgusting means beneath conventional sociological overviews antagonistic to paranormal elements. It was this year, 1970s paper that provided the basic stimuli for the contents of this present volume, but which, for several reasons, goes far beyond the limited contexts available back then. For example, when the original paper was produced, we were confined within the limitations of the terminology then available. The paranormal could only be referred to as such or by some variant of it, such as or psi, psychic, parapsychology, ESP, or powers of mind, etc. All of these being understood as paranormal in character. As it has turned out by now, however, the term paranormal, along with its variants, is in eclipse and out of fashion, having been replaced by the phrase exceptional human experiencing, EHE. So, with the exception of powers of mind, which still remains relevant, it will no longer be utilized in the text ahead, except in the case of a past historical context. The central focus of the 1970s paper was on sociological objections to the paranormal as it was then conceptualized. In this volume, the central focus and emphasis is on exceptional human experiencing itself, on its magnitude, and on some of its very many variants. Back in the 1970s, the concept of mindsets represented the only understood way of discussing formed attitudes and preconceptions vested in certain limited parameters. Therefore, the only way to discuss the sociological objections was to associate them with mindsets that were opposed for one reason or another to any opening up of positive oriented research into any aspect of the paranormal. As it has also turned out, the concept of mindsets has been almost entirely replaced by the concept of reality boxes. This is a favorable conceptual advance in that mindsets seem to refer to thinking patterns that have become trained or conditioned one way or another, whereas reality boxes seem more to relate to consciousness itself. Admittedly, this may be a subtle distinction between mind and consciousness, but it can be thought that mind might not exist without consciousness. And if so, the latter is greater than the former. In the early 1970s, the concept of consciousness had not yet acquired the luminosity it began to achieve in the early 1980s. The term was in use, of course, but it was generally understood as referring only to the awake state, while all else, such as the subconscious, unconscious, non conscious, and superconsciousness, were not exactly thought of as expandable elements of consciousness itself. In fact, the concept of the paranormal seems largely to have been brought into usage to distinguish between What was thought of as the average dimensions of normal awake consciousness and variations of consciousness awareness that did not fit into or could be explained within the average. During the 1980s, the crass distinctions between awake consciousness and other forms of consciousness began to break down. Several reasons for this can be detected, but a principal one was that numerous broad polls in the United States were taken during that decade, asking individuals what they experience of the paranormal. Almost a century earlier, in the 1890s, a similar kind of international census had been taken in England and Europe, the results of which were reported in English by Edmund Parish under the title of Hallucinations and Illusions, a study of the fallacies of perception, 1897. The title of this report reveals the prevailing attitudes of the time, in that the Victorians of the era were not all that forthcoming about experiencing hallucinations. In any event, after admittedly sorting and tossing out many responses as evidence only of mental derangement, Parish indicated that only 5 to 10% of individuals interviewed might have possibly experienced something of strange but real substance. 80 years later, however, the American polls resulted in radically higher percentages. In some categories, many of the polls indicated that as many as 75% of those interviews viewed had consciously experienced some form of paranormal consciousness. Since any statistic above 50 can be thought of as a majority and hence qualify as normal, the concept of the paranormal began to become normalized, after which the term also became useless and was ultimately replaced during the 1990s by the concept of exceptional human experiencing, EHE. The foregoing has been a rather longish way to synopsize a lot of intriguing history, but it serves to highlight a very important distinction. This has to do with the question of what the consciousness of humans can and does experience versus what they are supposed only to experience within the limits of this or that sociological norm, the cultural sociological norm, or the prisons that we need to break out of. One can flop around a lot in trying to figure out how that question might begin to be answered, but certainly there is a fundamental launch pad that is entirely relevant. Everyone is born with innate consciousness set and ready to go. If this is accepted, then all subsequent questions seem to pivot on what happens to innate consciousness after one is born with it. And a quote at the end by Marquis de Vauvenargues, 1715 to 1747, is: consciousness of our powers augments them. So let's become more and more conscious. Let's awaken with Ingo Swann's reality boxes and other black holes, black traps in human consciousness. Let's break free out of the nonsense from the elites and realize our full potential. And I can also see the direction going towards microdosing the holy teacher plants, the psychedelics. Maybe next time. Huh? Have a good time.